This is the third installment of the lecture on the theological themes of John. I'm Brent Riggers. Make sure you have a lecture outline downloaded from the student portal, and make sure you've watched and listened to the previous two installments that covered themes 1 and themes 2, and watch them in order. Those two themes are essentially capturing the essence of John's theology, and everything else kind of flows out of those two themes. Moving now to theme 3, we find that the story of Jesus is the paradoxical story of divine faithfulness on the one hand and human rejection on the other hand. And you can see from your lecture outline that this comes with both a kind of micro perspective and a macro perspective, so kind of small and large. The small picture, if you will, the micro perspective, is that of Jesus and Israel. On the one hand, we have a whole slew of references to God's faithfulness to Israel. The Word made flesh, first and foremost, is nothing other than the human embodiment of the God of Israel specifically. So the God of the Jewish scriptures, the God who creates Adam, makes promises to Abraham, a covenant with the people through Moses, the God of David, the God of the prophets. This is the God that becomes human, incarnate in the person of Jesus. Now, not surprisingly, when the God of Israel becomes incarnate, he proves faithful to the traditions of Israel. Somewhat distinctive to John, he takes numerous pilgrimages to Jerusalem for various kinds of festivals, not just the Passover, but also the festivals of booths and the festival of dedication. But for John, the God of Israel did not become incarnate simply to be an obedient Jew, but to do what only the God of Israel can do, namely to fulfill all the promises that God has previously made to Israel. In particular, the promises of salvation and eternal life. Eternal life, of course, was something we covered in the second lecture installment. The God of Israel comes to Israel in order to be her God in the most intimate way imaginable, by becoming one of her. And yet, tragically, aside from Jesus' inner circle of disciples, the dominant pattern really is one of rejection. Israel's rejection of her God. And here, just a word of caution about the term Jews. The Gospel of John is famous or infamous, if you will, for referring repeatedly to Jesus' opponents as the Jews. It's not the only term he uses, but it's the most common one. It's, of course, an anachronistic way of referring to Jesus' opponents because it suggests that Jesus is not a Jew. Of course, Jesus was a Jew, and to the extent that he had opponents that were Pharisees or scribes, or in one or two cases maybe Sadducees, these would have been fellow Jews. So it's very much a kind of caricature when John depicts Jesus' enemies as the Jews, or literally in the Greek, the Judeans, those ethnic people associated with the temple in Jerusalem and the religious social traditions that came out of that. Most scholars explain the emphasis on rejection by appealing to what they think must have been the situation of the Johannine community at that time in the late first century. By the late first century, Jewish Christians were becoming, at least in some places, increasingly ostracized by their fellow non-Christian Jews. So much so that by the time we get to the first century, evidently, at least in one Christian circle, opponents of the movement can begin to appear like Jews as opposed to followers of Christ. But of course, both anachronistic to Jesus' time and very much a caricature. More to the point, though, I don't think the dynamic of Jewish rejection of Jesus in John is really ultimately about Jesus's fellow Jews as much as it's about the state of humanity, the world, the cosmos, as John has it in Greek. It's about that more generally. If Jesus and Israel is the kind of micro perspective of this paradox of divine faithfulness and human rejection, then Jesus and the world is the macro perspective, the big picture, and I would argue the most, for John at least, important picture. So the macro perspective, Jesus and the world, in Greek cosmos. We have repeated references to God's faithfulness to the world. The world came into being through the Word, the Lamb, you'll remember, who takes away the sins of the world, John the Baptizer exclaims. For God so loved the world, I am the light of the world. Those are just a few. And then on the one hand, the world's rejection of or ignorance of the eternal Son made flesh, the Logos made flesh. Looking at your lecture outline, note how many of these references to the world or the cosmos come in the farewell discourses of chapters 14 to 17. We're going to talk about that in the next lecture installment. As Jesus prepares his disciples for a vocation of witnessing to him after the resurrection, which is what the basic purpose of the farewell discourse is, as he prepares his disciples for that vocation, he's preparing them for entering into the world, as it were. And there in that discourse, Jesus tells them that he has called them out of the world only to send them into the world for the sake of the world, to be witnesses to him. In the world, but not of the world, as the formula has it. So in conclusion, we might say, and this is point 3C in your outline, that the Jesus-Israel relationship is really simply a microcosm of the Jesus-world relationship, which is, theologically speaking, the most important one. That's not to say that we shouldn't take very seriously the fact that Jesus came from Israel and the traditions of Israel, and that this is precisely the God of Israel incarnate. That is foundational to John's theology. So on the divine faithfulness side, it starts there. But when it comes to human rejection of the incarnate Word, I think the emphasis theologically should fall on the bigger picture, the world, Jesus' fellow Jews who reject him being just a microcosm of that larger picture. So the kind of standard verse comes in the prologue to support this point. The Word was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. Most would say that's a reference to Jesus' fellow Israelites. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or of the will of man, but of God. So distancing this kind of rebirth from flesh, so to speak, suggests that the salvific significance of the incarnate Word goes well beyond the people of Israel and is of universal significance, in fact. So again, I think this suggests that the real conflict in the story is not between Jesus and the Jews. John, unfortunately, dwells on that caricature. And of course, the life of Jesus was a life spent mainly debating with his fellow Jews. But the term Jews repeatedly is a description of Jesus' opponents. That's very unfortunate. But ultimately, Jesus' rejection by his fellow Jews exemplifies or embodies his rejection of the world at large. So that's the third major theme of John, not as substantial as the first two themes, but a corollary of them and something that is significant for understanding John's theology and perhaps John's ecclesiology and John's understanding of the mission of the church. So we'll turn in a fourth lecture installment to the fourth and final theme of John.